I was just a private back then, young, eager, and a little naive. The Germans had taken Pavlovs House a few days before we got the order to retake it, a 4-story apartment building located in the heart of Stalingrad, overlooking 9th January Square and the Volga River. It wasn't just any building, it was strategic. Whoever controlled that place had the high ground, and it was up to us to take it back. We were part of the 13th Guards Rifle Division commanded by General Chuikov. We had been fighting for days, but nothing could prepare me for what we'd face inside that building. The assault began early in the morning on September 27th, 1942. We approached from the northeast under the cover of a light morning fog. My squad was led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, a man whose name would soon become legendary. He was calm, calculating, a leader who didn't waste words. His eyes were always scanning, always watching. He was the kind of leader who kept his emotions in check, who never seemed rattled no matter how bad the situation. We were told there were German forces inside, but we had no real idea of what to expect. Pavlovs House had already been fortified. The Germans knew how important it was. The square in front of the building was quiet for the moment, a false calm. We moved quickly through the rubble-filled streets, our boots squelching in the wet ground. The Volga River, visible in the distance, seemed so close yet so unreachable, like it belonged to another world. The air was thick with dust, the sky a dull gray, heavy with the weight of artillery. I could hear distant rumblings of explosions, but for now, the street in front of the building was silent. We were about 30 men, spread out in tight formation, each of us carrying rifles, grenades, and a few pieces of precious ammunition. Some of the older men had anti-tank rifles slung over their shoulders, the weight of them making their steps slower but more deliberate. We were trying to move as fast as possible, knowing the longer we spent in the open, the more we risked drawing German fire. I could hear the distant sound of German machine guns opening up on the left, then a sharp crack as a sniper's bullet whizzed overhead. The air seemed to thicken with tension, every footstep louder than the last. But Pavlov kept us moving, his face set in a grim determination. There was no time to waste. We were going to storm the building and clear it out. That was the plan. When we reached the outer walls of Pavlovs House, everything changed. The building loomed before us dark and imposing, its windows shattered from previous battles. It was a hulking, damaged structure, evidence of the previous fighting, yet still standing defiantly against the enemy. Our first wave of attackers, the platoon leading us, was already inside, pushing the Germans out, but we had to clear each floor and secure it. The entryway was filled with rubble, blocked by debris. A few of the men began clearing the way, throwing grenades into the corners, making sure nothing was left behind. The first grenade explosion shook the building, sending chunks of concrete and wood flying. It was the moment I realized how close we were to the enemy. From here on out, it wasn't going to be a fight for a building, it was going to be a fight for survival. The Germans were dug in well. We pushed through the entryway and into the building, and that's when the real horror began. We advanced cautiously, clearing every room, every hallway, moving floor by floor. Pavlov led from the front, his orders crisp and sharp. There was no room for hesitation. Every step forward could be our last. I remember the close quarters, gunshots echoing off the walls, the sharp tang of smoke in the air. The building was claustrophobic, every corner hiding a new threat. The enemy wasn't giving up easily. We were met with fierce resistance, machine gun fire, grenade blasts, men shouting in German, and the constant, oppressive sound of gunfire outside. I saw one of our men go down, A burst of gunfire caught him in the chest as he moved into the stairwell. I can still see his face, the surprise, the shock, before he collapsed. There was no time to mourn. We had to keep moving. The Germans were dug in deep, and we were too close to stop now. We fought our way through the building floor by floor. Grenades were thrown into rooms before we advanced. Pavlov didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for the sound of victory. He just kept pushing, moving us forward, making sure we held our ground. I remember feeling the sweat pour down my back, feeling my legs burn with every step. My rifle was heavy in my hands, and every shot I fired felt like it had more weight behind it. By mid-afternoon, we had cleared the bottom 2 floors, but the upper floors were a different story. The Germans had set up machine guns on the higher levels, and they didn't intend to let us have them without a fight. We were pinned down for what felt like hours. The crack of sniper fire, the high-pitched whine of bullets passing close to my head, it all blurred into a single deafening roar. But we couldn't stop. We had to keep moving. It was Pavlov who finally made the call. "Move up. We're not stopping until we own this building." His voice was steady, unwavering. We scrambled to the 3rd floor, clearing each room as we went. I remember the tension in the air, every footstep an invitation to death. But by nightfall we had pushed the Germans back. The building was ours again. But I knew deep down that the real battle was just beginning. That night we sat in the darkened rooms of Pavlovs House, our backs against the cracked walls, the air thick with dust and smoke. The building had been cleared, but at what cost? How long could we hold it? The answer was simple: until we couldn't anymore. But we had made it through the first day, and in Stalingrad, that was all that mattered. The night after we had cleared the building, Pavlov gathered us in the main hall, the dim light of our lanterns flickering against the walls. It felt unreal, sitting there, exhausted, in a building that had been nothing but a battlefield hours before. I could still hear the crack of gunfire from the streets, the thudding of artillery rounds falling not far off. The silence within the building was a strange, heavy thing. In that moment, I realized that Pavlov's house had become more than just a structure. It was our last line of defense, and it had to become a fortress. Pavlov spoke calmly, his voice low and measured. "This is ours now," he said, pointing to the walls, the stairwells, the rooms that would soon be turned into makeshift bunkers. "We will hold it at any cost." The others nodded in agreement, already pulling out tools and weapons. The German counterattacks would come. We all knew that. The question wasn't if, but when. We spent the following hours fortifying the building, working in shifts to prepare for the inevitable. We weren't just soldiers anymore. We were builders, engineers, and defenders. The windows were boarded up, leaving only small slits for us to shoot through. We took turns digging trenches in the rear of the building, laying down communication lines. Sandbags were piled high against the walls, and machine guns were set up at key points. The stairwell was rigged with grenades ready to be detonated in case the Germans tried to take the building floor by floor. The men worked in silence, the only sound being the scrape of metal on stone, the occasional cough from one of the wounded, or the soft whisper of Pavlov giving orders. Despite the exhaustion, we knew we couldn't stop. Our survival depended on how quickly we turned this building into a place where the Germans could not reach us, where we could stand and fight, no matter how long it took. I found myself assigned to a group reinforcing the 2nd floor. We took every piece of rubble we could find, bricks, broken furniture, whatever we could use, and stacked it against the walls. There was no luxury of time. Every minute counted. The building, which had once been an apartment complex, was becoming a war machine, a deadly, cramped labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each one turned into a defensive position. I remember how cramped everything was. Men, wounded or not, slept in the hallways or crowded into rooms that once housed families. Every space in the building felt too small, too suffocating. There was no privacy, no room for comfort. Even the stench of sweat and blood became a part of the place, mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder that lingered in the air. We moved through these spaces like ghosts, never staying still for too long, always on alert, always waiting for the next attack. The top floors were transformed into sniper positions. I worked with a few others to set up our anti-tank rifles, PTRD-41s, aiming them through the shattered windows that had once framed views of the Volga River. It was strange looking out through the holes at the world beyond, knowing that in just a few hours, everything could change. The street below had already become a killing ground. Every corner was a potential threat, and we had no choice but to remain vigilant. We made do with what we had. Food and water were scarce, brought in by a few brave souls who risked running along the riverbank under heavy fire. I don't know how they managed it, but they did. The rationing was tight, and we had no idea how long it would last. Some of the men had taken to boiling whatever scraps they could find, mixing them into a disgusting, flavorless mush. But we ate it, knowing that even the smallest meal might make the difference between life and death. I remember feeling a strange, detached calm in those hours of preparation. The reality of our situation hadn't fully hit me yet. It was like we were in some kind of suspended animation, waiting for something to happen, but not knowing when or how. We worked tirelessly, knowing that every hour spent reinforcing the building could mean our survival in the days ahead. By morning, we had turned Pavlovs House into a fortress, at least that's what we told ourselves. The walls were fortified with sandbags, anti-tank rifles were set up at every entrance, and our machine guns covered every angle of approach. Every corner was checked and double-checked. We were ready, or so we thought. But even then, in the back of my mind, I could hear the quiet, insistent voice that whispered the truth we all feared. We couldn't hold this forever. The Germans were coming. It was only a matter of time. That afternoon, the first of the German counterattacks arrived. We heard the distant roar of tanks and the muffled clatter of infantry as they advanced through the streets. The building trembled with each explosion. I pressed myself into the corner of the second floor, watching through a slit in the wall as the first wave of German infantry moved into position. We didn't even have time to breathe before the first mortar hit the ground nearby, sending dirt and debris raining down through the floorboards. And then the gunfire came. The Germans opened up with everything they had: machine guns, rifles, and the terrible, gut-wrenching sound of tanks advancing. But we didn't flinch. We had prepared for this. We had made our stand, and we would not give an inch. Pavlov's voice cut through the chaos, directing us, keeping us in line. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The first German wave came at us from the right, a massive infantry moving through the smoke, their uniforms barely visible in the dust and haze. We opened fire, our rifles cracking in unison. The street outside was chaos, the air thick with dust and the smell of burning fuel. The Germans fell one by one. I could see the looks on their faces as they dropped, their hands clutching at the air, as if they were reaching for something, anything, to save them. But there was no escape. The fighting was close, brutal, and unforgiving. Each room we defended felt like a battleground in itself. Grenades exploded nearby, and the walls shook with the violence of the assault, but we didn't stop. We fought through the night, and by dawn, the Germans had pulled back. The building was still ours. We didn't celebrate. There was no time for that. We just went back to the work of reinforcing our positions, knowing that the next wave would come soon enough. And so we waited, and we prepared again. It wasn't long before the first true counterattack came. The Germans had regrouped, their artillery thundering in the distance, shaking the very foundations of Pavlovs House. It felt like the world was collapsing around us, the ground trembling beneath our feet as mortar shells burst against the building's exterior. The walls that we had so carefully reinforced groaned under the weight of the bombardment. I could feel the vibrations of every explosion in my bones, the tremors running through the floorboards, rattling the windows. I was positioned on the second floor, watching the street below through a narrow gap in the wall. The Germans didn't waste any time. They came at us in waves, infantry first, followed by their tanks. It was a well-coordinated attack, the kind that we had feared. My comrades and I huddled close to our rifles, our fingers itching for the first sign of movement from the enemy. The first thing I remember clearly was the sound of tanks approaching. They rolled down the street, their massive steel bodies creaking with each turn of the tracks. I'd never seen anything like it before, not up close. Their machine guns were firing, spraying the street with a deadly curtain of bullets. Every window was a target, every movement in the building an invitation to death. We could hear their engines roar, and for a moment it felt like the world outside was drowning out everything else. I turned to Pavlov, who was standing at the front, calm as always, his eyes scanning the streets below. He didn't flinch at the roar of the German tanks. Instead, he gave a single command and we moved into position. "Hold your fire," he ordered, his voice steady without hesitation. He knew that this was only the beginning. The tanks were too far out to hit directly with our rifles, but the Germans had underestimated us. The second we saw an opening, we let loose. One of the men, a soldier named Mikhail, took the first shot. He fired from the second-floor window, his rifle coughing out the shot. It was a good one, a clean hit. The tank, still several meters away, began to sputter and jerk. The shot had struck the engine, disabling it. A second shot rang out from another rifle, followed by another and another. One by one, we took aim and fired, hitting the tanks wherever we could. It wasn't long before the tank's turret exploded in a brilliant fireball, sending shards of metal flying through the street. The Germans were forced to pull back. They didn't expect us to fight like this, not in a building like this. But Pavlovs House wasn't just a building. It was our symbol, our last stand, and we would make them pay for every inch. The infantry, however, was still coming. I could hear their boots on the ground below, moving through the streets. Mortar fire began to pound the area around us, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. I remember looking out the window, seeing the Germans pushing forward through the fog, and that's when it hit me, the sheer force of it. We weren't fighting just to hold a building. We were fighting to hold the line. And that line was the last one between them and victory. The first wave of German infantry pushed through the street. The sound of their boots, the crack of their rifles, it was deafening. There was no time for fear. Pavlov barked orders, moving swiftly between positions, directing us as we began firing from the windows and the makeshift barricades we'd set up. I didn't know how many we were facing, but it felt like hundreds. The Germans weren't pulling back. They were coming at us with everything they had. I remember a soldier to my left, his rifle raised as he fired, the look of determination in his eyes. He was killed in an instant, a sniper's bullet taking him right between the eyes. The blood splattered against the wall beside him, and I was thrown into the frenzy of it all, my heart racing, my hands shaking as I fired round after round. The building was alive with gunfire, grenades exploding outside, and the crash of metal as enemy tanks tried to breach the street. One of the German soldiers managed to get close to the building and lob a grenade through one of the lower windows. It exploded with a deafening roar, sending debris flying. We took cover, but the damage was done. The explosion had killed 2 of our men. The smell of blood and burning wood filled the air. Pavlov was still calm. He had seen it all before. His orders never wavered, his voice always steady, cutting through the chaos. "Move to the next position," he said, his face as impassive as stone. We moved like automatons, going through the motions of war, the fear and panic buried deep inside. There was no time to think, no time to feel. The Germans kept coming. They didn't stop. We had no choice but to fight back, and we did. We fired from every position, dropping their soldiers one by one. But for every German we killed, it felt like 3 more appeared in their place. The street below was littered with the dead, the air thick with smoke and the smell of blood. The night fell, and the fighting didn't stop. The explosions outside had died down, but the Germans weren't finished yet. They continued their push, using every weapon at their disposal. The sound of their mortar fire echoed in the distance, followed by the crack of their machine guns. It was only a matter of time before they would try to take the building, but we were still here, and as long as we were here, as long as we still had a breath in our lungs, we would fight. I didn't know if we could hold Pavlovs House forever, but in that moment, as I crouched down behind the barricades, rifle in hand, I knew one thing for sure. We were going to make them pay for every inch. By the time dawn broke, we had pushed the Germans back, just enough to catch our breath. The building was still ours, but the night had shown us one undeniable truth. The Germans wouldn't stop. Not until they took this building. And we wouldn't stop either. Not as long as we had the strength to fight. It had been days since the first wave of German attacks, and each day felt like we were living in a nightmare. The constant bombardment from German artillery shook the building to its core, and the sound of mortar shells whistling through the air was a constant companion. We no longer had the luxury of thinking in hours or days. Time had blurred into one endless stretch of fear, hunger, and survival. Every day felt the same, each one just a countdown to the next attack, the next explosion, the next death. The Germans didn't stop. Their artillery pounded us day and night. The building itself, which had once been just another structure in Stalingrad, was now a crumbling fortress, riddled with holes, walls shattered by mortar fire, windows blown out. But we held it. For the moment, we still held it. I remember waking up every day, crawling out from under the rubble, and the first thing I would do was check the windows, check the walls, check the lines of defense. We weren't just soldiers anymore. We were rats in a trap, constantly digging for ways to survive, constantly reinforcing our defenses. Pavlov was always there, always directing us, his voice steady and unwavering, even when the rest of us were starting to crack. He never complained. I can't remember a time when he did. Every command was precise, every order followed to the letter. I learned then that survival wasn't just about weapons or tactics. It was about resolve. It was about never giving up, no matter how bad things got. And things were getting bad. We had little food. The supply runs were dangerous, often made under the cover of night, bringing whatever scraps we could get. Canned meat, bread, anything. I remember the taste of that bread, stale and dry, but it was a lifeline. And when the water came, it came in tiny amounts, just enough to wet our throats, but never enough to truly quench our thirst. The river was close, but we never dared to go near it, not with German snipers covering every possible path. So we rationed what we had, just like we rationed the bullets in our rifles, the grenades, and the Molotov cocktails. The wounded were piling up. Some of them were still fighting, their wounds wrapped in whatever cloth we could find, but others were fading fast. We couldn't evacuate them, not without risking our own lives. So they stayed, trapped in the building with us, their groans of pain a constant reminder of the price we were all paying. I saw men who had been struck down only to return to the fight hours later, bandages wrapped around their arms or legs, their faces pale from blood loss, but determined to stay in the fight. There was no choice. If you were still breathing, you fought. I had learned a lot during those days. I had learned how to make the most out of the scraps we had, using old furniture to block doors, using anything we could find to patch up the walls. But one of the most valuable lessons came from Pavlov himself. You always fight from the ground up. We dug trenches inside the building, moving from room to room, so that no matter what part of the building the Germans attacked, we could respond quickly. Every corner, every crack in the wall was our advantage. Every piece of the building had become a weapon. It wasn't just about defending Pavlovs House anymore. It was about surviving the night and making sure the building didn't fall to the Germans. The fight wasn't just in the streets anymore. It was inside those four walls. They came at us in waves, trying to break through the lower floors with tanks, infantry, and flamethrowers. But each time they pushed forward, we pushed them back. The tanks would roll up, their guns blazing, but we had our anti-tank rifles, and we knew how to use them. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. If you had a clear shot, you took it. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for a perfect moment. We had to act. The flamethrowers were the worst. They would try to burn us out, sending streams of fire into the windows through the walls. There was no escape when they did that. We had to fight them off from inside, trying to douse the flames with whatever we could. I remember the heat of it, the choking smoke, the fear of watching the fire crawl closer to us. But we didn't retreat. We didn't run. We held our ground. We used our grenades to blast through the walls, creating new positions, always adapting. At night, when we could finally catch our breath, we would hear the sound of distant artillery, the rumbling of German tanks, and the echo of footsteps on the street outside. We could hear the cries of the wounded, and we knew that if we faltered, if we hesitated, the Germans would come again. The Volga River, which had once seemed like a distant, unreachable thing, was now a symbol of the Soviet rear. It was our lifeline, our connection to reinforcements and supplies, but the Germans had it under constant surveillance. We couldn't get any closer without risking sniper fire. Still, we knew it was there, just beyond our reach, reminding us that we weren't truly alone. Somewhere out there, our comrades were fighting to break through, and we had to hold out until they did. Every day we watched our numbers dwindle. The wounded couldn't be evacuated, and with each passing hour, it felt like we were losing more ground. But Pavlov didn't let us give in. He kept us focused. "Hold until the end," he would say. "We fight, we hold. That's all we do." It wasn't much, but it was enough. We didn't need to know the bigger picture. We only needed to know what we had to do to survive. In the dark, in the silence between the attacks, we found moments of reflection. I remember staring at the rubble, wondering how much longer we could keep going. We had no reinforcements. We had no guarantee of victory. But we had each other. And in that, we had everything. The building was holding. We were still standing, and that was enough for now. Days blended into one another. There was no distinction between morning and night, only the sound of gunfire, the occasional whistling of shells, and the constant tremor of mortar impacts. The air inside Pavlovs House was thick with dust, smoke, and the heavy stench of fear, sweat, and blood. Every inch of the building had become a battleground, every room a new front. We had fortified the place as best we could, but it felt more like a tomb than a stronghold. Every day we fought off the Germans, and every day they came back with more force. I lost track of time after a while, but it didn't matter. The fight for Pavlovs House had become everything. The Germans, relentless as ever, had begun to target our position with more precision. It seemed as though they had us figured out. Every corner we fortified, every barricade we set up, they tried to counter it. They had snipers on the rooftops across the street, picking off anyone who dared show themselves. The sound of their rifles was like a constant crack of thunder in the back of my mind. We took to moving only when absolutely necessary, staying low to avoid the deadly line of sight the Germans had. The higher floors were the most vulnerable, and we were forced to rotate positions frequently. You never stayed in the same place too long, and you never left yourself exposed. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of war. Walls that had once separated families now divided us from the enemy. We had turned the entire building into a defensive maze. The lower floors were covered in rubble. The upper floors were shattered with broken windows and exposed beams, while stairwells were reinforced with anything we could find. The structure was a death trap, but it was our death trap. We made it work. It wasn't just the Germans that we had to worry about. The building was falling apart. Artillery and mortar shells were a constant threat. The walls shook with each impact, and parts of the upper floors collapsed from time to time. Every time I heard the rumble of an incoming shell, I braced for the worst. It wasn't just the possibility of death from the Germans. It was the risk of being buried alive beneath the ruins. There was no safety in Pavlovs House, just survival. At night, the building came alive with the sounds of explosions and gunfire from all directions. We huddled in the darkest corners, waiting for the Germans to try and breach the walls. It wasn't the firefights that kept me awake. It was the quiet. In those moments between attacks, when everything was still except for the occasional rattle of the building, I would lie on the cold floor, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. The groans of the wounded became constant, a reminder that death was never far away. In those hours when the battle seemed to pause, the silence was more frightening than the noise of combat itself. It was in those moments of quiet that I realized just how close we were to losing it all. The Germans had begun to implement new tactics, sending wave after wave of infantry to storm the building. They would send in their soldiers to overwhelm our positions while their tanks and artillery pounded the area relentlessly. The first time I heard the sound of a flamethrower roaring in the streets, I froze. It was like nothing I had ever experienced. The flames shot up like a serpent from the depths of hell, sweeping through the lower floors. There was no escaping it. The fire would crawl up the walls, licking at the windows, reaching for us. We had no choice but to fight back with whatever we had. But sometimes it was enough to just stay low, to let the fire pass over us as it roared outside. That was when we began to learn that survival wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about managing every resource we had. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, everything became a precious commodity. Each bullet felt heavier, each piece of bread worth more. We rationed everything, our food, our energy, our strength. I remember one of the men, Mikhail, gathering everyone at the end of the day to make sure we were eating in shifts, taking turns to rest. He was trying to keep morale up, but it was hard to keep the spirit of the men alive when the world outside the building was falling apart. The snipers in the upper windows had us pinned down for what felt like days. I remember the sound of a bullet passing so close to my head that it left a ringing in my ears. The shots came from every direction, always with deadly accuracy. Every time I raised my head, I expected it to be the last time. I had learned to live with the fear, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Each shot was a reminder that death could come at any moment. Inside, we fought not only the Germans, but also the building itself. The walls were crumbling under the pressure of the constant bombardment, and there was no way to escape the chaos. The floors had become slippery with the blood of the fallen, the air thick with the stench of death. There was no place left to hide. There was only the fight, the endless fight for the ground beneath our feet. One of the more surreal moments came when we found a piano on the 3rd floor, left behind in an apartment that had been ransacked long ago. We had no use for it, of course, but the absurdity of it struck me. Here we were, surrounded by death and destruction, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground, and yet there was this piano, untouched, as if it belonged to another world. One of the soldiers, a man from Odessa named Lev, took it upon himself to turn it into a storage space for grenades. He called it the grenade piano, and it became one of the strange little ironies of our life in that building. At night, we would rest next to it, the sound of distant artillery drowning out the memory of what it had once been. But even in that madness, we held. Pavlovs House, battered and broken as it was, stood firm, and we stood with it. We had no illusions about victory. We were just trying to survive, but somehow, through it all, we kept pushing back the Germans, fighting off each attack as it came. We weren't just fighting for a building. We were fighting for each other, for the men who had already died and the ones who still had a chance to make it out alive. The Germans had nicknamed the building Das Haus der Toten, the House of the Dead, and as much as I hated that name, I understood it. The building was a graveyard. It was a tomb, and we were the ghosts haunting it. But we didn't give up. We wouldn't. And every time we repelled their attacks, it was a victory in itself. Each day we held it was a small triumph, no matter how fleeting it seemed. By mid-October, Pavlovs House had become a world unto itself. The outside world, Stalingrad, the river, the rest of the Soviet front, felt distant, like a dream half remembered. The battle for the building had taken on a surreal quality. We were no longer soldiers, not really. We were prisoners of war, but the war had no end. Every inch of the building had been transformed into something else, something darker. There were no comforts here, no luxuries. The fighting, the losses, the sheer isolation had stripped us of everything but our will to survive. The Germans didn't make it any easier. They were relentless. Every day the mortars fell, the artillery pounded the building, the snipers took their shots. And every night we listened to the sound of footsteps in the street below, Germans, stalking the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. But we didn't have the luxury of mistakes, not anymore. Every move had to be calculated. Every bullet had to count. We spoke less and less. Conversations became brief, almost mechanical. It was always about survival. What food we had left, how much ammunition, who was still alive, who needed attention. We rationed everything: water, food, energy, time. The wounded, those who could still fight, worked together to keep the defenses up, to reinforce the floors where the Germans were most likely to break through. The less wounded would take over the positions, covering the rooms that needed guarding. There were no complaints. There was no space for complaints. There was no time for grief. But even the silence couldn't mask the toll of war on us. I remember the quiet desperation in the men's eyes. the way their faces grew gaunt, hollow from lack of sleep and food. The wounded, those who had made it through, kept asking for help, for bandages, for something, anything to stop the pain. I saw one of the men, a soldier named Sasha, lying in the corner of one room, his eyes wide but vacant. He hadn't spoken in days. No one knew what had happened to him. The terror of war had finally taken him, not with a bullet or grenade, but with the silence between the explosions, the weight of being trapped in that building day after day. The building had become a tomb, and not just for the dead. It was for us all. Each floor was like its own little world. The upper floors were for the snipers and the anti-tank units, the middle floors for those manning the machine guns and barricades. But there was no real division. We all worked together, moving between the floors, going wherever we were needed, never staying in one place for too long. Death was always at our door, and the building, as much as it kept us safe, was also suffocating us. The walls were too close. The rooms were too small. There was no escape from the constant pressure. We had little more than the clothes on our backs and the weapons we'd brought with us. It was a strange feeling to be living in the ruins of a place that had once been so ordinary. Pavlovs House had been a home once, somewhere where people had laughed, where children had played. Now it was a battlefield, a place of death, a place where every corner we turned could be our last. But we weren't thinking about that. We couldn't afford to. The wounded were shuffled between rooms. Those who could still move helped those who couldn't. There was no sense of hierarchy, no officers, no rank. We were all equal in the eyes of the enemy, and in the eyes of the building that was slowly crumbling around us. One day I found myself sitting next to a man from Siberia named Kirill. He had been badly burned in one of the earlier attacks, his face a mass of blistered skin and charred flesh. But he still insisted on fighting. "We are still alive," he said, his voice weak, "and as long as we are, we must fight." I didn't know how to respond. I had no words. I just nodded and passed him a bottle of water. There were moments, rare moments, when the building seemed almost quiet. The explosions would stop for a few minutes and the muffled crack of gunfire would fade. We would allow ourselves to believe that the world outside had forgotten us, that we were safe. But we all knew it was just a brief respite. The Germans would return. They always did. There was one night shortly after another wave of mortar fire had passed, when I found myself standing at one of the shattered windows, looking out into the darkness. The night sky was a deep, dark blue, and the glow from the burning city illuminated the smoke that hung in the air. It was strange, that quiet. Strange how the fire outside seemed distant, like it belonged to another time, another world. It was then that I realized how much Pavlovs House had become a part of me, how much it had become a part of all of us. We had been inside it for so long that I couldn't remember what the world outside was like. What had we been before this? Before the war? Before the siege? But the silence didn't last. Another round of mortar fire erupted, the building shaking once more, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. I ducked down, instinctively covering my head. It wasn't until the explosion subsided that I realized how much we had changed. We were no longer just soldiers. We were survivors, and that was enough. The strangest part, though, was that despite the constant shelling, despite the mortar blasts, despite the screams of the wounded and the constant fatigue, I felt a strange pride. It was not a pride in victory. We hadn't won anything, but it was a pride in how we had held the line, how we hadn't given up. Every day we fought and every day we survived. There was no glory in it, but there was something deeper, something primal, that kept us going. We weren't just fighting for Pavlovs House. We were fighting for each other. The building had become a part of us, and we had become a part of it. It was a strange, twisted kind of home, but it was home nonetheless. The days dragged on, and the weight of the siege began to feel unbearable. There were no guarantees of reinforcements, no relief in sight. Every day we fought, we watched more comrades fall, and the building itself seemed to grow weaker by the hour. The Germans had stopped underestimating us, and we had stopped expecting an easy victory. It was a grim dance of survival. Each step forward felt like a fragile breath, like a temporary reprieve. Then, one evening, just as the sun set in a fiery glow over the burning city, there was a sudden sound that I hadn't heard in what felt like forever. The low, rumbling sound of Soviet boots moving through the trenches. A squad had arrived. Reinforcements. The feeling that surged through me was indescribable. We hadn't seen another soul outside our walls in weeks, and now, here were men from other parts of the front, as ragged and worn as we were, but somehow more hopeful. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Pavlov was as cool as ever. His voice never changed, never wavered. "Take them inside," he ordered, and we moved quickly to guide them through the ruined floors of the building. The newcomers looked around, their eyes wide at the damage, at the state of the place. They had no idea what they were walking into, and we didn't know what to expect from them either. In a battle like this, there were no guarantees that reinforcements would be able to hold, or that they wouldn't break under the pressure of a building that had already been pushed to its limits. But these men, these new soldiers, were hardened. They had seen the brutality of the front lines, the same as we had. The difference was they were fresh. They hadn't lived through the endless shelling, the sniper fire, the isolation. They still had energy, a kind of vigor that we had long since lost. Some of them were barely older than boys, and they looked at the ruined walls of the building with something between awe and fear. But the fear didn't last long. Pavlov wasted no time assigning them tasks, setting up additional defenses, reinforcing the rear, repairing some of the damaged walls. The newcomers brought new rifles with them, more ammunition, and a few crates of supplies that we hadn't seen in weeks. It wasn't enough to change everything, but it was a lifeline. The food rations increased, though still sparse, and a few men could be spared for more specialized tasks, like checking the external positions or moving the wounded. The addition of these soldiers was a momentary boost in our spirits, but the reality remained unchanged. Every inch of the building had to be fought for, and we were still surrounded. I remember one of the young soldiers who had arrived with the reinforcements, a fresh-faced kid named Andrei. He had barely any facial hair and looked like he hadn't seen a day of real combat before joining us. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling slightly as he checked his rifle. I could see the fear in his posture. He wasn't ready for this. I don't think any of us had been ready for this. But then Pavlov spoke to him quietly, his voice calm and reassuring. "We hold," he said simply. "You hold." The new men were eager to prove themselves, to show they were worthy of being part of our unit. But Pavlov made sure that we all remembered the most important thing: patience. There would be no grand gestures. There would be no miracles. The Germans would continue their attacks, no doubt about that. What mattered was our ability to keep fighting, to keep holding, no matter how impossible it seemed. But it was in these moments that the cracks in our defenses began to show. Andrei, eager as he was assigned to the upper floor sniper posts. He hadn't been trained for such things. He didn't know what it felt like to sit there waiting for the crack of a rifle shot or the sound of boots in the street below. I remember seeing him there sitting with one of the veterans, his hands sweating as he held his rifle. His eyes kept darting back and forth like he was looking for the enemy. But he wasn't seeing them. Not yet. The older veteran, a man named Kirill, who had been with us since the beginning, took the young soldier under his wing. He didn't say much, but his experience was clear in the way he moved, the way he watched the streets below. Kirill had the look of a man who had seen too much, who had survived too many battles to be surprised by anything anymore. Andrei would learn soon enough. There was no room for hesitation in a place like this. You either acted or you died. The night that followed was quieter than most. The artillery didn't come in waves. The German infantry didn't try to push through. It was a brief respite, a calm before the storm. We took advantage of it, getting some rest, organizing the new supplies, and reinforcing the areas most likely to be attacked. Andrei, though still nervous, had already started to settle into his new role. He took up his position in the window, rifle in hand, his gaze scanning the streets below. The rest of us knew better than to believe in quiet nights. Pavlov had been here long enough to know that silence was only temporary. The next attack could come at any moment, and we had to be ready for it. And so we settled into the strange rhythm of life in Pavlovs House. Every day was a test of endurance, every hour a struggle for survival. We weren't fighting for glory. We weren't fighting for a medal or a parade. We were fighting for our lives, for the lives of the men beside us. In the days that followed, more reinforcements came through the same trench system, moving quietly and quickly to avoid the Germans' detection. But each new arrival only reminded us of how fragile our position was. We were still isolated, still cut off from the rest of the Soviet forces. No one could guarantee that we would hold the building for much longer, but we had no choice. We had to hold, not for ourselves, but for those who would come after us, those who would remember what we had done here. By the time the next attack came, Andrei had found his rhythm. His rifle cracked in unison with the others as we repelled the German push. And though the Germans came harder, faster, and more fiercely, we stood firm. Pavlovs House still stood, and it was a symbol of something the Germans didn't understand. Defiance. We were still alive, and that for now was enough. By the end of October, we had become well acquainted with the deafening roar of German artillery, the booming crashes of shells landing in the streets, and the sharp, sickening sound of debris falling as our positions collapsed under the bombardment. But this time, something felt different. There was an edge to the air, a heaviness that we had not felt before. The Germans were massing for something bigger, something more vicious. We all sensed it. Each one of us could feel the shift. It was the calm before the storm. We had been holding Pavlovs House for weeks, fighting off wave after wave of German soldiers, tanks, and artillery. But we knew that no matter how many of them we repelled, eventually they would throw everything they had at us. We could only hold for so long. The thought had been lurking in the back of our minds ever since the first night we set foot in this building. What would happen when the Germans finally brought everything they had to bear? And now, we were about to find out. It started with the rumble of their tanks. The ground shook beneath our feet as they rolled down the streets, their engines thundering in unison. The first tank reached the square by midday, a hulking mass of steel and death, its guns pointed straight at the front of Pavlovs House. We had already seen tanks before, but this was different. This time there were more. There were many more. And this time, the infantry followed close behind, like a swarm of ants eager to destroy everything in their path. I was stationed on the second floor, near the windows that overlooked the main street. I could see the tank's turret turn slowly, its gun aiming right for us. I could hear the rattle of infantry advancing behind it, their boots marching in sync with the thunder of the tanks. There was no hesitation now, no more time for second thoughts. The Germans were coming, and they were coming with everything. Pavlov's orders were precise, as always. Prepare to repel the tanks. Keep them at a distance. Hold your fire until they're in range, he said, his voice cold and steady. We had learned by now that there was no room for panic. Panic would get you killed. The machine guns were set up, and anti-tank rifles were aimed through the windows. We had Molotov cocktails prepared just in case, but despite the preparation, a knot tightened in my stomach. We had done well before, had taken down tanks, had killed Germans, but this was different. The number of enemy forces was overwhelming, and our numbers were shrinking. The reinforcements had helped, but they hadn't solved our fundamental problem. We were surrounded, and there was no way out. The first shot rang out as the tank fired its main gun at the building. The force of the blast shook the walls, sending dust and rubble falling from the ceiling. The impact was deafening, and for a moment I couldn't hear anything but the ringing in my ears. I saw the shock on the faces of the men around me, but there was no time for fear. Pavlov shouted orders, and we moved into action. We fired everything we had. The anti-tank rifles cracked loudly, but the tanks kept advancing. The Germans' infantry followed behind them, advancing with terrifying speed, their soldiers ducking low and moving swiftly. We took down a few of them, but for every soldier that fell, 2 more took their place. The tank moved closer, its turret swiveling, searching for a target. I could feel the sweat running down my face as I steadied my rifle, watching through the gap in the window, trying to find an opening. It was as though the entire street had become a battlefield, the chaos of war playing out in real time all around us. The tank's cannon fired again, and this time the explosion shook the building harder. The wall next to me cracked open, sending fragments of stone and debris flying into the room. A scream erupted nearby. One of the soldiers had been hit by shrapnel, and he collapsed, his body twitching in the aftermath of the blast. But there was no time to check on him. There was no time to mourn. Pavlov moved quickly, barking orders as we fired from the windows, trying to keep the Germans at bay. "Molotovs! Molotovs now!" he shouted. We tossed the Molotov cocktails, one after another, watching as they exploded on the tank's hull, sending fire licking up the sides. The tank jerked violently, its movement stalling for a moment. The explosion sent flames crawling along its body, but it kept coming. The Germans were relentless, and we had no choice but to keep fighting. And then the infantry hit. They came charging at us, sprinting through the street under the cover of tanks and artillery. We fired back with everything we had, rifles, grenades, Molotovs. But it felt like we were fighting a storm. For every German soldier we took down, 2 more were behind him. The house shook with each explosion, and I could feel the walls of Pavlovs House groaning, creaking under the pressure. It was as if the very building itself was beginning to give up. I don't know how long we held them off. Time had stopped making sense. Hours felt like minutes, and minutes stretched into eternity. But the tank had been disabled, its crew either dead or scattered. The infantry, however, didn't stop. They tried again and again to break through our defenses, but we kept pushing them back. We were exhausted, barely able to stand, but we couldn't stop. Not here, not now. By the time the night fell, we had managed to hold the building. The Germans had retreated, but I knew they would be back. They always came back. There was no victory in that, just a moment of respite, a brief lull before the next wave. I remember the sound of the wind outside, the hiss of artillery fire in the distance, and the quiet of our men, all of us exhausted, leaning against the walls of our ruined fortress. Pavlovs House still stood, but at what cost? The building was broken, as were we. But we had survived. For now, that was enough. By mid-November, the air in Pavlovs House felt different. It wasn't the quiet, deathly stillness that we had grown accustomed to. This was something else, something more distant. For the first time in weeks, the shelling had subsided. The night, though still filled with the low groans of artillery far off in the distance, had quieted just enough to allow us to think, to feel. But we couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The Germans had pulled back from our positions, and though it didn't feel like victory, it was the first sign that the tide was changing. Pavlovs House had become a broken shell of what it once was. The walls were crumbling, entire floors had collapsed, and we were down to only a handful of men from the original defenders. The new reinforcements, though still green, had fought valiantly, but even they had begun to lose hope. We'd taken countless casualties, some of whom were still lying in corners, too wounded to fight but unable to leave. The house stank of death, of blood, and of decay. Yet we were still here. We had survived, and for reasons we didn't fully understand, the building hadn't fallen. Not yet. I had become numb to the loss. The shock of battle, the constant threat of death, had faded into the background of my existence, but still there was something inside me that resisted surrender. Maybe it was Pavlov, maybe it was the men around me, but something told me that we had to keep holding, that as long as we could stand, we would. I remember standing by one of the cracked windows late one evening, staring out across the burning city. The smoke from the bombed-out buildings hung low in the air, and the red glow from the distant fires illuminated the skyline. It had been weeks since I had felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and I wondered if the world outside would ever be the same again. The Volga River, once a symbol of hope, was now barely visible through the haze. We had no communication with the rest of the Soviet forces, and I could feel that isolation again. The thick, suffocating silence that made the building feel even more like a tomb than it already was. But then, in the distance, I saw something I'd not expected to see. Movement. A shadow on the horizon, no bigger than a speck at first, but growing larger by the second. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. Then, the unmistakable sound of artillery rang through the night, sharper and more pronounced than it had been in weeks. The Germans had pulled back, but they hadn't retreated entirely. Something was happening outside Pavlov's house, something bigger than anything we could have expected. I turned to the others, calling out to them, but my voice felt small and insignificant in that moment. I saw Pavlov standing in the corner of the room, his eyes hard with focus. His face, grizzled, covered in stubble and dirt, was as stoic as always, but I could tell he was aware of the change. He gave the order to prepare. "Move to the windows," he said quietly. "Get ready for the next wave." But this time it wasn't a wave of German infantry or tanks that came. It was something else, something we had all been waiting for, but none of us dared to believe. The ground began to shake again, but this time it was not the tremor of an enemy advance. It was the rumble of our own forces moving forward. There was a silence, a collective breath drawn between us all, as we realized the Germans were beginning to retreat. I watched as the infantry advanced, Soviet soldiers appearing from the smoke of the city. They came from the rear following the line of the Volga. The first wave of reinforcements wasn't through our door, but it was here. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, had begun. I had heard whispers about it before, of the larger strategy, of how the Germans had overstretched their forces and how the Soviet army was preparing to encircle them. But it never felt real, not until I saw it with my own eyes. Soviet troops pushing into the German flank, liberating parts of the city that had been under siege for weeks. I couldn't help but feel the weight of it, the hope, the possibility. It was happening. We had survived long enough to see it. Pavlov ordered us to hold our positions. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice cutting through the hope that had begun to stir. "We keep our ground until the final push. No surrender." The order was simple: defend the building until we were relieved. We had fought for so long, had given so much, and now, when it seemed like victory was within reach, we couldn't falter. Not now. But the Germans, seeing the writing on the wall, began to retreat. Slowly, methodically, their forces withdrew from positions around the building. We had broken them, worn them down. Their morale was shattered, and their lines were crumbling. The sound of their retreat was almost surreal. We watched as the German forces began to fall back, their once unyielding strength now unraveling under the pressure of the Soviet advance. The tanks that had once menaced us now rolled back in retreat, leaving the streets eerily quiet. Pavlov stood tall, watching the retreat unfold with a quiet satisfaction. But even then, I could see the tension in his face. He knew that the fight wasn't over yet. "We hold," he repeated, as if it were a mantra. As the German forces began to pull back from the surrounding streets, we stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The air had changed, the smoke had lifted slightly, and the distant sound of artillery fire now felt different, less immediate. For the first time since we had entered Pavlovs House, I felt a wave of something I hadn't expected: hope. The sun was barely visible through the haze, but it cast a pale light over the streets of Stalingrad. The ruins, the crumbled buildings, the scarred landscape, none of it was gone. But the presence of Soviet forces, the feeling that the tide had shifted, was undeniable. The Germans were on the run. We had done it. We had held out long enough to see the tide turn. In those moments, I knew we had made it. Pavlovs House had withstood the storm, and so had we. The siege was broken, and soon the Germans would be pushed back entirely. We had survived, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world seemed to breathe again. Now, I'm an old man. The years have passed, and the world has changed in ways I never could have imagined. When I think back to those days in Pavlov's house, I don't see it as a building anymore. I don't see the rubble, the smoke, the broken walls. I see the faces of the men who fought alongside me, those who survived and those who didn't, and I see the pride in their eyes. We weren't heroes, you know. Not like the ones they write about in history books. We were just men. Ordinary men thrown into extraordinary circumstances, fighting for our survival, fighting for each other. When the counteroffensive finally came and the Germans began their retreat, we thought the worst was behind us. The weight of those months, the constant bombardments, the ever-present threat of death started to lift. Pavlov's house, this broken, scarred building, still stood. It was our wall, and we held it. We never let go. But what no one tells you about war, about surviving something like that, is that it doesn't end when the fighting stops. The physical wounds heal, and the war moves on, but the scars inside, the memories, they stay with you forever. I remember when the orders came for us to leave the building. It was one of the most surreal moments of my life. After all we'd been through, after all the days and nights spent in that hell, we were finally being pulled out. The building that had been our tomb for so long had become something else. It had become a symbol. We weren't just defenders, we were survivors. Pavlovs House had become a part of us, and we had become a part of it. But when I look back now, I don't think about the destruction. I think about the men. I think about the way we fought for each other, how we held on despite the odds. It wasn't the building that mattered. It was the bond we forged within those walls. When you're trapped in a place like that, you don't just fight for the building or the mission or the flag. You fight for the man next to you. You fight because he's the one who will either pull you out of the fire or be the one to drag you back into it. The war was won in Pavlovs House, but the victory wasn't for the generals. It wasn't for the medals or the parades. It was for the men who held that building, who held it with nothing but grit, determination, and a refusal to give up. We stopped the Germans from advancing, yes, but we also stopped them from taking something far more precious. We stopped them from taking our dignity. After the battle, the city started to rebuild. The war continued, of course, but for us, for those of us who had survived the siege, there was no going back to what we were before. You don't leave a place like Pavlovs House and go back to your old life. You carry it with you. It stays inside you, buried deep, always there just below the surface. I never went back to Stalingrad. They sent us home after it was all over. The war had ended, but the scars didn't fade. It was hard to walk down the streets of my village, seeing everyone so oblivious to what had happened, so untouched by the horrors we had faced. They thought the war was over, and it was, but for men like me, it was never over. Pavlov was a hero, and they made sure everyone knew his name. They gave him medals. They honored him in ways that no one had ever honored us. But none of us wanted that. We didn't need medals or statues. We didn't need anyone to remember us. We just did our job. We held that building, and in doing so, we held a line for every man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union. That was enough for us. But when I think back on those days, on the days of fighting, of surviving, I think of the faces of my brothers. I think of the men who died there, who never got to see the victory they helped secure. I think of the ones who carried the weight of that place in their hearts even long after the fighting was over. Some of them were broken by it, their minds fractured from the horrors we witnessed. Others carried on, but something inside them was lost forever. You don't survive something like that without leaving a piece of yourself behind. Pavlovs House isn't just a building to me. It's a tomb for the men who gave everything for a piece of ground. It's a monument to the will of those who refused to bend, refused to break. We weren't heroes. We were just soldiers who did what had to be done. We fought and we held. And in the end, that was all we could do. They remember Pavlov now. They talk about him like he was the symbol of what we did, but for me, it wasn't about Pavlov. It wasn't about the house. It was about the men who fought alongside me, the ones who didn't come back and the ones who did, carrying their ghosts with them. We were the wall that didn't fall, and for that I am proud. But I'll never forget the faces of those who didn't survive. They are the true heroes of Pavlovs House, and they deserve to be remembered.